Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, I didn't expect I would come so early to Israel, because when Galit wrote to me last summer saying, oh, we're thinking about having a bill for a children's commissioner, what do you think? We're thinking about those ideas and so on, and we started a dialogue. And I said, if it goes like all of the countries that I've been to and supported in the establishment of a children's commissioner, you know, well, maybe in 10 years they're going to call me and say, okay, we're ready now. And so here I am about 6 months later, and the bill is ready to be adopted very soon, so that's very encouraging. And I have to say that the process that has been set up to establish and the discussions that have been ongoing with the strong support from the Israeli Fund for UNICEF have been all really wonderful and encouraging efforts. So what I'm going to talk about, it's a bit technical, but I hope I'll be able to make it accessible to you, is to try to discuss together what is a Children's Commissioner, what is it supposed to do, and how it has worked in other countries. So first of all, what are we talking about? Children ombudspersons, children commissioners, they have different names depending on the countries. In the US, for instance, we are called children's advocates, are public institutions, and that's very important because it means that the state has committed to establish within the public sector an institution devoted to children's rights. So it has to be established by law, and it has to be financed by public budget. The role of a Children's Commissioner is to monitor the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's what CRC stands for. By the government and by all actors in society. So it's a watchdog for both the public sector but also the private sector. And the goal is not just to criticize, but it's mainly to be constructive and to make suggestions on how to improve the system. So for instance, for policy making, if you make a policy for children, how is it going to work? And also in the practice of people who work with children. It has to be independent, because otherwise, who is going to trust someone who is not independent, who we think has a political agenda, is trying to get another job, or is trying to get elected? So independence is very important. It means that the institution doesn't receive any orders from the government. It functions autonomously, it has its own budget, and it is free to choose its agenda, its priorities, and to say this is what I think is important in the country. And most importantly, and the study that is going to come out this year from the Innocenti Research Center will be titled Voices for Children, because this is really what it's about. It's about having an institution that hears children's voices and then is able to translate them and communicate them to decision makers so that they can integrate them in their work and in their decisions. Why are they particularly important for children? First, because children are more vulnerable to rights violations. I think this is something that we all know, that their opinions are rarely taken into account, so there needs to be somebody to voice their interests. They do not vote. Why don't they vote? They represent, I think in Israel it's 1/3 of the population. So that's a whole chunk of the population that cannot have a say in decisions that affect their daily lives on education, on health, and other issues. They have difficulties accessing the judicial system because oftentimes they need representatives, so they cannot seek remedies directly. And they also have difficulty accessing organizations that can protect their rights. So what they are about is helping the system work better for children. So you see, that's usually how a system works. And the Children's Commissioner is the drop of oil in the system that will help it just function better. And if we think about it, I think in this country, we know that a little bit of oil can make a lot of miracles and can bring light. So I think if you manage to have that little bit of oil, you can make a lot of things work better for children. Where do they exist? This is just to give you an idea of how many countries in the world have established children's commissioners either just Children's Commissioner or as part of a broader human rights commissions working for everyone. There is a total of 71 countries. The blue ones are the ones that are specific on children, and the orange ones are where there is a human rights commission, and within that there is a commissioner or an office responsible for children's issues. And the one in brown are the countries that are discussing the establishment of the children's commissioner. And Israel, of course, is small, but we put it in brown now, just before coming. There are international standards that apply, and these have been, there are two sets actually. There is the Paris Principles, which have been adopted by the United Nations in 1993 by the General Assembly, and they relate to human rights institutions in general. And then there is a committee that's called the Committee on the Rights of the Child that sits in Geneva and monitors internationally how states are doing in implementing the CRC. And sometimes we adopt what we call general comments to help states understand how to implement certain part of the CRC or certain issues. So they issue the general comments on human rights institutions for children, so children's ombudsman. And I would like to underline a couple of important issues. And when we compare both, we see what is it that makes an institution good for children and child-friendly. One important thing is the establishment process. It's not mentioned in the general human rights institution, but for children's rights, it says that the process should be consultative, inclusive and transparent, be supported by the highest level of government, and be discussed by the state, the legislature, and civil society. And from what I've seen so far, I think this is exactly what's happening here. A second important aspect is the competency. For human rights institutions, it only says the public sector. For children's rights institutions, it's also the private sector, because as we know, children are often dependent on private actors. They might go to private schools, but they're also under the care of parents for private actors. And they may also be victims of private companies' strategies, like for instance, they want to try to sell you something, to sell food that's bad for you. So private entities also have an important effect on children's rights. Another important aspect is an individual complaint mechanism, which is optional for general human rights institutions and mandatory for children's rights institutions. I'll get back to this. And two other important aspects are about the activities, and we see that for children's rights institutions, it's very important that the institution works with children, echoes their views, has direct contact. And this is what makes a difference with general human rights institution, where it just says, okay, talk to the press. But here it's not enough. We really need a dialogue. So if we look at the legal mandate and how it's being implemented and how ombudspersons work concretely, we need to underline that the law is very, very important, but it needs to be translated into a functioning office. Otherwise, what's the point of having a law? So what's a functioning office? And I will go through these four characteristics one by one. The first one is independence, and I already mentioned it. It is particularly important to appoint the right person, and the right person is someone who's solid, who's competent, and who's committed, and who has independent thinking, who's able to push the agenda. And for that, you need a good appointment process. So you need in the law a process that will enable you to have the right person in the job. That means that the process should be transparent. It shouldn't be just one person sitting in a ministry deciding, okay, let's take this one here. There needs to be consultation in the society. In Ireland, for instance, the ombudsperson was chosen by children themselves. They interviewed her. They had role play. They put her in a difficult situation. They said, okay, I'm a child in a very difficult situation. How would you handle my case? What would you say? And in the end, they told the government, okay, this is her that we want. And she used to be a nurse. And she got the job. And when you talk to her, you just see she has children in her heart. There needs to be a its own budget line in the state budget, and that's already in the legislation in Israel, in the draft at least. So that's a positive point. It needs to have real powers to investigate, because the role is to do research and to understand what works and what doesn't. So if you don't have the power to get the information, it won't work. And the problem is that for children there is a lot of confidential information, and sometimes agencies that have the number of cases and know how many children have suffered abuse, exploitation, and it's a very sensitive issue. But they won't relinquish the information to the institution that needs